I talked about this.
Nobody's listening to you.
I like his additions. I think it makes it a lot more clear.
Yeah. Right.
Highlighted parts.
Well, this we talked about. I said, does this really apply to single family? And he's like, you know, so I think then. Yeah, but why would it
I was so proud of
like that's
Yeah, but that's already a full assumption. This is so think about that though. That's what we were talking about. Like, does this really apply to everyone else for multi-family? If not, we should say so. Because I think that's the problem that Barry said too, like trying to write it for both multi-family and single family. So if we mean multifamily or single family, we should just, you know, I think this one
Well, if there's
is
nothing
going
to discuss before we go on the record, I think we should go ahead and get started. Good morning. This is the second workshop in case number 18-38-IMD, Investigation into Renewable Energy Standard Rulemaking. My name is Elizabeth Schilling, and I'm a staff attorney with the Commission, and with me today is Tom Mauer, who is the policy director for the Commission. And I am still learning names, so if everyone could go around quickly and introduce themselves, that would be really helpful.
Ann Margolis with Department of Public Service. Marie Fisher with Department of Public Service.
Dave Schwannock with the Department of Public Service.
Dr. Williams, Vermont Electric Co-op.
Melissa Bailey with Vermont Public Power Supply Authority and Burlington Electric Department.
Lisa Morris, Vermont Electric Co-op.
Jeff Monder, Green Mountain Power.
Carolyn Anderson, Green Mountain Power.
Ray Albrecht, National Biodiesel Board.
Olivia Campbell Anderson, Renewable Energy Vermont.
Doug Smith, GMP.
Andrew Quint, Green Mountain Power.
Phil Powell, Washington Electric.
Paul Lambert, Efficiency Vermont.
Matt Rutherford with the Town of Stowe Electric.
Matt Cota, Vermont Fuel Dealers Association.
Keith Levinson, Department of Public Service.
Kelly Lander, Department of Public Service.
Patty Murphy, Department of Public Service.
Thank you. So the primary purpose of today's workshop is to discuss comments that were submitted by the participants on January 18th, 2019. So before we jump into going through the comments, does anyone have anything to raise or anything? All right, if not, I think we should just jump into going through the department's comments. They seem to lay out the majority of issues that the various participants were interested in. And so if we just go through those and then talk about the responses to those, and then folks can have discussion, ask questions. Does that work for everyone? All right. So in the department's comments, the first issue that was raised was the RES data collection and compliance. And they filed an Excel spreadsheet as a proposed method of compiling all the data. I know some of the participants worked with the department or provided some comments, but I know not everyone did. And I believe the proposal is that the spreadsheet would not be a part of the rule, but would be used to implement the rule. So the spreadsheet's fairly detailed, and I don't know if everyone has copies or not. I mean, we could go through the spreadsheet today, or folks could work together collaboratively to propose a joint final spreadsheet to the commission. Folks could also just provide written comments on what the department has already filed, what would work best.
I think we would be just as happy to work collaboratively and file a final spreadsheet if that works for all the participants.
I think that would be ideal. And since that's not a part of the formal rule itself, obviously we'd like to have a final version before we file for formal rulemaking, but I would say the schedule for that is not as tight as getting like the draft rule together. move on to the next item, or any other thoughts on the spreadsheet?
Does anyone anticipate having thoughts that they haven't raised already, or?
So I just have a question. Was this, so that's the spreadsheet that we would use for our final filing over the summer in August. But this would not relate to the format of what we submit to the department on March 15th. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And we can check in at a later workshop on where things are with the spreadsheet. So the next.
So just to follow up, so however we're filing in March is okay? That whatever format we're using, is that acceptable?
Well, I mean, ideally, as far as an overall summary table, I'd like, something along the lines that we filed previously that kind of lays it out for all the projects, just so there's one area that all the DUs report and it's the same table in the same format, so that we can do a fairly easy kind of comparison between what's going on. But other than that, I think that discussions are around how the DUs will ultimately file the March stuff is something that can be handled at a later date, but I would like that little piece of consistency at least for this time round if possible.
Yeah, I don't. Oh, sorry. Probably wonder. It might not have been quite clear in our comments, but for the annual plan summary table, we were envisioning that you be used both for the plan as a projected and then the actuals in the March report.
No, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the department's comments, under tier 3, the department had recommended that a summary table be used for submitting the annual tier 3 plans and reports. And so that would be the thing that would provide the consistency, not the Excel spreadsheet. And so maybe as a part of working collaboratively on the Excel spreadsheet, you all could work collaboratively on the table.
Sure.
Yes, Olivia?
I just had a question. So, and I don't know if this is further on in your agenda. What sort of then transparency is there for RES Tier 3 compliance about the specific projects? It sounds like we're talking about end-of-year annual summaries, and I'm wondering if the details of the specific projects are going to be available to the public, or even if there is some need to redact information, etc.
So I can start with my answer and then others can chime in. So with the tier 3 projects, the utilities submit their tier 3 plans to the commission, and we're going to be discussing those a little bit more further on. And then in March, they submit what they've done in the prior year to meet their tier 3 requirements consistent with their plan, and then those get reviewed by the department and then ultimately approved by the commission, and all of that is submitted through PUC, and there's public process around that.
Yeah, my concern is it's been very difficult to get the details of the specific tier 3 projects, and there is no public transparency if they only go from the utility to the department, and information about the projects is not publicly available. And therefore it's only like a summary. So we would like to see more transparency around specific project details, rather than just a summary that gets provided to the department that may or may not be publicly available unless someone submits a public information request. So,
are you wondering about prescriptive tier 3 projects or custom projects?
My concern right now is around the custom projects because the prescriptive projects are pretty clear. For example, if Burlington Electric has an electric vehicle incentive and they say what it is and this number of people received it, that we obviously we don't necessarily see additional value in saying, nor both in consumer protection of these are the individuals who did that. But around the custom projects, there doesn't seem to be any transparency or public process, and that's of concern to us.
Patty, did you have something?
Yeah, I had a question for Olivia, and I think she just answered it, but I was trying to differentiate program offerings versus projects, and it sounds like you're looking for just anything that's like a specific delivery of end uses to a customer. Because all the programs that WEC has are general. It's like, here's the program, and
Right.
the program is the same for any participant. I'm differentiating a project versus a program.
Right.
So program
so-
descriptions are completely available in public.
Yeah, so I think, perhaps I was using the wrong terms. Thanks for clarifying. So I think that the interest would be more in the what's the right term, non-prescriptive, custom projects.
Yeah. So there is an issue with the custom projects and the level of information that can be provided, because some of those projects involve proprietary information from customers that we just can't, openly share. Otherwise, the customer might not take on the project. So, there's a level of information, a summary level of information that can be provided openly, but then there's a level of information about the project, the identity of the customer, and specifics about the project in some cases that may not be readily shareable without making it so that the customer could not take advantage of the Tier 3 incentive.
So I think it's something that needs to be discussed, because certain things are over, whether information's redacted or more detailed summarized, but saying, for an example of that there were 50 custom projects and it was this, and having none of that information available to the public or anyone is not very transparent or effective. And I think Efficiency Vermont deals with it all the time with their custom incentives. I don't know if there's anything to learn from their reporting process. And I'm just posing a concern that I think needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time understanding the concern and just wondering if you could add a little more color to what kind of information it is that Rev would be looking for and what is lacking that isn't available, and like what level of detail would you be looking for, obviously acknowledging customer privacy concerns. And maybe if you could speak a little bit more about what Rev's concern is, I guess.
Well, one, we would have concern anytime that there are ratepayer funds being used to subsidize something and there's not transparency and public process. So as an overarching issue of integrity related to the renewable energy standard. So two, I think it would be helpful to have general information around, rather than something summarized that 50 projects were completed, that there needs to be some more information. So we could certainly provide some concepts in some follow-up comments, but I'm just right now laying out a concern around the transparency and integrity of the RES, which needs to be limited right now.
Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to put on for the record, I think that the RES is very transparent. I think most of our programs, the vast majority of programs, are general programs, and certainly for WEC, we've advertised and we want to get information out what the programs are. There may be a small bucket that Olivia's raising concerns, but in general, I think that the RES has been very public, very transparent, because we want to get members and customers participating so that we can claim our megawatt hour savings. So I just want to make sure to characterize that for most of the programs, like 95%, it's very public and transparent, in my opinion.
Matt Coda on behalf of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association. I want to agree with Olivia that transparency is key here for two reasons. One is, after the fact, after it's reported, there are experts that may not be privy to the discussions between the department and the PUC and the vendors, and that we might be able to provide some insight or some opportunities in the future. Secondly, the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association filed a Freedom of Information Act request with regard to one of the custom projects because we feel that we could have contributed to that project and increased the Tier 3 credits for that distributed electric utility. Unfortunately, that did not happen, but if we had advance notice that these discussions were happening, we feel we could have improved the project.
Sorry. Just a quick question. Are you going to be involved in the initial planning phase of the projects, potentially, if it's something along those lines? Because that's basically what would be required if...
With the project that we asked for the FOIA request, it was specific to a conversion to distillate fuel, which we have lots of expertise about. And instead of converting to distillate fuel from 6-oil, if that vendor or that recipient converted to a biodiesel blend of distillate, the Tier 3 credits to the distributed utility would have gone up exponentially. And we could have worked at a partnership with the recipient of that conversion and the distributed utility in a non-adversarial manner, but in a cooperative manner that would have improved the environment here in Vermont and would have improved the financial balance sheet for the distributed utility.
But I'm still not understanding, because if you receive the information when they're doing a compliance filing, like, that's too late.
Yes.
It's already happened. So I think what you're saying, what Barry's saying, that you really want to try to find a way to be part of the planning process. It's not so much about
That's
the
correct.
end compliance, knowing the information about the project after it's happened.
Yeah, I would say both are true. Yes, you're correct, Barry. You're correct, Kelly.
Right. And to the issue over the transparency of the custom project, part of the issue that the department has with that is that in order to verify these custom projects, the level of information that we need in order to do that includes an awful lot of personal identifiable information, customer name, address, account numbers, service records of equipment, all of which, if we have it, is subject to FOIA requests, such as the Vermont Fuel Dealers done. And as I understand it, the department doesn't necessarily have the authority to even redact that information in a FOIA request. So that's one of the things that we are going to be looking at, how to be able to be both transparent and still protect the participants' privacy. And that's a kind of very difficult thing to try and figure out how to do. EBT has certain protections that the department doesn't have, which is why we're having issues trying to address that. I think that we're potentially going to be looking either, there's two avenues. One, potential protective orders over this information, and the other is perhaps a statutory change as to what would be required to be provided under a FOIA request for this particular type of activity that the department has to undertake.
So how do we work with EBT?
Well, EBT isn't subject to the same sort of FOIA as well.
So we go look.
So we go look. We have that information. A lot of that is handled between a third party and EBT. There's NDAs between the third party and EBT. So none of that information necessarily travels through the department. So we don't actually have ready access to it. So it's not in our systems. If there's a question or anything about a project, we can go in and we can get that information. We can view it on EBT systems, but we don't generally take copies of that, simply so that that would not necessarily be subject to a FOIA request. However, that information is available on request from EBT. I think that would require the customer to agree that this information be shared. But project information, project level detail, all of that is available, just not necessarily the specific customer who is getting that project.
I'm still assuming that the customer information protection confidentiality could be addressed through legal channels, which I would imagine that it could. I'm still struggling with this from a Tier 3 implementation process standpoint, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding the request. Would it be that every time a utility was engaging with a customer about a potential custom project, that would have to be filed with the PUC, made public, potentially open for comment, and other stakeholders would be able to weigh in and potentially bring other resources to the table. I'm just struggling with whether that's feasible and what that would do to timeline and how that influences the customer's interaction with the utility. And I don't think there's any parallel requirement for EVT to run custom projects and make them public for comment, which is also an expenditure of ratepayer funds.
Yeah, I don't think there would be interest in adding even more layers of review and approval to projects and, slowing the process down. So there's sympathy in that regard. But just to back up what Matt has said, that there's a sense, I'll be very frank with everybody here, that this has become an electrification program. The original legislation that Vermont passed a number of years back envisioned a broad range of technologies under the Tier 3 program, and it has focused almost exclusively on electrification measures. So I think there's a disconnect between what was intended with the program during the legislative phase and what it has become. We have offered comments. We orally at the last meeting, and then in writing, that we think that the obligated parties here should put out open calls for projects, measures under Tier 3. Okay, and with it's clear that we need to address confidentiality, personal information types of issues. And I think we can work through that. But one of the concerns that we have is that, yes, in many instances, there would be opportunities for renewable fuels, whether it's solid biomass or biodiesel, or renewable hydrocarbon diesel, which is also a newer form of diesel fuel. And how do we get into the system just on an equal playing field, with electrification measures? And so we have suggested that utilities offer open solicitations, calls for measures, okay, whether they are general programs or custom measures, and be open to all submitters, regardless of what part of the energy sector that they might come from. And I think that would address a lot of questions. Our concern is biodiesel is a relatively low-cost form of renewable energy, and it would compete very nicely with a lot of the more expensive measures. And it's I think runs contrary to the intent of your original legislation here in Vermont to get skipped over, so to speak. Okay, so I would see if there were open calls for projects that biodiesel would be very much in the mix, but we are concerned. We have expressed comments that the PUC staff should have some oversight role in the project selection, not to dig too deep into the weeds, but we have some issues here.
If I could, I don't know if that totally addressed your question.
No, I think it's taking us down a different path, but
Yeah, well,
I can either just respond quickly, or we can put that, we can hold.
Are you gonna put on your BED hat?
Well, I would remind the group, I think, Burlington Electric did issue an RFP for Tier 3 projects and selected them based on price. And I just, as speaking on behalf of EPSA, we've been really transparent about our prioritization of electrification measures at the expense of other measures, and that's been a deliberate strategy, and that's because of our belief that minimizing the cost shifting under Tier 3 is a priority, and recovering revenue that can be shared among all ratepayers is preferable to investing in potentially alternative fuels, which can be cost effective and can have a benefit for the customer, but we've prioritized equity among ratepayers over that. So I think that's been a transparent and clear policy choice. We've put it in our annual plan each year, and without further direction from the PUC, that's probably the strategy we're going to continue to pursue.
Yeah.
I just think that has to be, electrification will be on a different playing field than alternative fuels because of the funding source. These are electric ratepayer dollars, so unless we get a different policy direction, that's the strategy we'll pursue.
We understand what you're saying, but we would voice the opinion that this particular topic then needs further discussion. So.
We're definitely open to that.
And just going back to your prior question, did Rev have any response about the process or information?
I mean,
Really
not at
different.
this time. It seems like it might be a good idea for the department and, you know, for various folks to get together with the department to understand what the existing process is and what our paths, to ensure that the RES Tier 3 statute, which requires partnerships to meet its, for utilities to meet their compliance, is being undertaken appropriately, and there's some either transparency or ability for partnership. I think the BED RFP was, you know, a great path that one utility took to address that. So.
I would just add that, you know, we've established numerous partnerships in the interest of finding and completing custom Tier 3 projects. So we've been really open to conversations, and I can say confidently, I don't think we've turned anybody away. We've been open to every conversation that's come our way, and we've been outwardly, you know, reaching out to find folks that can bring ideas. So, you know, we're eager to have those conversations.
Although the solicitation that you referred to, I mean, was that ever advertised via the channels of communication that we use within this forum? And, you know, I mean, Matt Coda has been sitting in on a number of meetings. It would seem that, and we've had much of these discussions, you know, repeatedly, okay? And it would seem that if BED were issuing a call for ideas, that perhaps somebody at BED ought to have given Matt a phone call and just give him a heads up, you know. So, you know, we're all busy people, you know, so, you know,
I wonder, one of the requirements for annual plans that I think maybe has not always been addressed by the utilities plans, or maybe not addressed as robustly as could be, that maybe would get to some of these concerns, is the requirement that if there's electrification projects, that the plan demonstrate how the utility analyzed such projects and to see if there were least cost alternatives that did not increase electric consumption. If that was maybe more robustly and directly addressed, would that kind of get to, and that would be in the plan, so it would be before things happened, and there's an opportunity during the planning process to have stakeholder comments. So that might be something that would be helpful to address some of your concerns.
Perhaps. I also, though, think it doesn't address the issue around transparency for the customizable projects or the need for partnership with non-utility service providers in compliance with Tier 3. But that's that's something we should definitely look at. Thank you, Kelly.
So, just to follow up on that, I've always been confused by that language and how, from a practical perspective, we would demonstrate that for a prescriptive measure. Because the way that our programs work is we have an offering. We have a series of offerings to people. If you want to do a heat pump, we'll give you this amount. If you want to do a pellet stove, we'll give you this amount. If you want to do an electric vehicle, here's your incentive. And so it's almost like we would have to drill down to that particular customer and what their other options were for how to change their heating, change their transportation. And it's a level of detail, I just don't understand how we would actually include that as part of our program planning. You know, what the alternatives that were not electrification, because it's usually just status quo. It's usually just continue heating with your oil, continue driving your, you know, gas vehicle. So I would just, if we are going to go down that path with, you know, some more, I would just want some more detail around what that means for the language included in our plans.
I agree that it's hard to say how to exactly implement that portion of the statute, but I'm glad that Kelly brought it up because that was one point that I had highlighted after receiving the TAG Tier 3 annual report a few days ago. It's something that we've been asking for a few years, and I think it's one of the things that we need to nail down in the next few months before we file the rules, is how will utilities be complying with that aspect of the statute. So we can have that discussion today, or we can kick the can down the road one more time and let you all discuss it behind the scenes.
I think at the very base level, if there is a custom project that is not an electrification project, that is switching 6 oil to 2 oil, and we know that by increasing the biodiesel content of that 2 oil, that we can add Tier 3 benefits to the distributed utility. There should be at least a phone call, and that the sellers of biodiesel shouldn't find out a year after filing a FOIA request that custom project was conducted.
You know, with the right amount of wordsmithing, I think it's possible to provide project descriptions, you know, for the custom category that give people a heads up as to what it is that's being funded without necessarily, violating, their rights, to a certain level of privacy. And we all are in that business of written communications, okay? So, you could say, okay, a manufacturer in southern Vermont is being supported to do such and such of a measure, okay? I think something along that lines would address and resolve a number of the questions that have been raised here. So, and my comments really were based on the general issue of transparency across Tier 3, okay? Because we're familiar with how electric and thermal RPS programs run in the rest of New England, okay? And Vermont is different, okay, in terms of who does the implementation and decision-making of specific measures. In most other states, there's a pre-qualification measure, the sifting of technologies, the awarding of credits is handled by, the state, and the electric utilities, the obligated parties basically have to purchase, the certificates, okay? And so there's an arm's length to the transaction, whereas in Vermont we do not have that arm's length nature, okay? And I think that that needs to be addressed.
No, I mean, I think Kelly's teed up the question, but.
We're happy, the department's happy to add that to the list when we meet with the DUs about the annual plan template and the compliance template. We can add that to the list and report back.
Okay. So let's see, I've got to look at my outline for a second and see where we are. Are folks ready to move on to a different topic? Yeah? Okay. So going back to the department's comments, the next comment was related to the tracking of environmental attributes for energy from Hydro-Quebec and the New York Power Authority. So the department had proposed that for Hydro-Quebec that we would continue to use the current process for the utilities, which is providing the attestations from Hydro-Quebec. And then for the New York Power Authority, the department proposed working with the utilities, Velco, and the New York Power Authority to register the appropriate units so that going forward, RES compliance attributes would be tracked in the pool of GIS. So I guess I had a question related to that, and whether the department anticipates being able to register those things with NEPL.js before we would commence formal rulemaking in July.
It should definitely be very doable.
Okay.
Yeah, Velco is going to be the one kind of doing most of the work.
Okay.
They just want some sign off from the utilities before they get started on that.
All right. And so if those New York Power Authority units are registered in NEPL.js, would the recs then be tracked like all other recs in NEPL.js?
Yes.
Okay.
You would have to still submit a qualification application.
Okay.
But then they
So there wouldn't be a
certified.
special process, it would just be the normal
Right.
process. Okay. So did anyone else have comments, questions about the Hydro Quebec and New York Power Authority renewable energy standard process?
I just had one kind of procedural question. Why would Velco be, what's Velco's role in this?
Velco receives those attributes from NYPA and then transfers them to the DUs, I believe. Is that right?
So WEC is getting the attributes through BEPSA.
Velco
But
transfers them to
upstream-
BEPSA
upstream.
and then.
Okay, from BEPSA, right. Just trying to
Yeah,
loop in all the steps
Velco
here.
is like the market participant.
Okay. Still on NYPA.
Correct.
Okay. And the contract with NYPA is with the DPS. Velco's administering the contract with ISO through the ISO market system. Is that
Correct.
correct? So the DPS doesn't have a,
The DPS
a
doesn't have an
market
ISO
position.
account or an NEPL GIS account that we can receive and transfer racks. So that's done through Velco.
So assuming Velco, I mean, I would assume Velco, the procedural aspect through Velco would be an easy thing. Do we have
Yes.
any issues with NYPA converting having them actually say, yes, these are the recs that are associated with the power that are coming to all the Vermont DUs?
For Niagara, it should be very clear cut. It's in the contract that includes the attributes. St. Lawrence, an agreement was not reached, so that contract does not include the attributes. Although I understand that they are transferring, they've continued to transfer the quantities for both Niagara and St. Lawrence.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else on this topic? Let's see, so the next issue that the department raised was the res qualification for Vermont Tier 1 and 2. And they suggested requiring that applicants provide the CPG number, that the registrations be reviewed quarterly, and that there be an opportunity for the utilities to provide comment on the registrations. Do folks have questions or comments about that department recommendation? Okay, I know, I do too. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Olivia, you're in charge of speaking for developers today. What do,
We prefer the term energy innovators
Okay.
or renewable energy providers.
for all those entities, do you have any comment on reviewing the qualification forms on a quarterly basis in bulk rather than doing it on a case-by-case basis, one at a time?
No, I mean, I think so long as it's clear. I think so long as it's clear and traceable, that's fine.
I think from our perspective, in terms of implementation, I think it would be more efficient to do it on a quarterly basis. And so what we would need to do is know the important dates for the utilities in terms of when does the NEPL.js quarter close, and then we need to go, back up a certain amount of time to start our process for review. And then my question for the department is, why is it important for the utilities to have an opportunity to comment during our review process?
So I think one of our concerns is that one of the items that we would be reviewing is whether the recs are, basically have already been transferred to the utilities or to another party through some sort of other agreement, for instance, net metering, so that we're trying to avoid the issue of double counting. So we feel that the resources that we have access to ensure that, the checkbox wasn't checked during the net metering registration form process or application form process that would say that the recs have already been given to the utility. We'd either be looking at the original form as filed in PUC, or the other sort of native place for that to be recorded is with the utilities. They are also tracking whether the recs have been given to them, at least under the net metering program, and therefore whether they're giving the project an adjuster, appropriate adjuster for that. So because we're consulting, basically secondary sources to us that aren't our native sources, we also feel that it would be a double check for the utilities while we're looking at the EPC and the native registration form, that the utilities would be able to check against their own systems to ensure that they're not already being, that rec is not already being transferred to them. So it'd be sort of a secondary check on that.
I'm just, knowing the challenges that we all have had in tracking which, particularly on net metering projects, have been applied for, been installed, and what the deposition of the recs are for CPGs. Is there any way that to do some of this automatically through, obviously with the recs you would need to check with verification, but is there a way that you could look at updating the EPUC so that there's a box of yes, it's installed, or there's an easy check-off box related to the rec? I'm not sure if I don't think there is an easy box on the recs, so that some of the data can, it will take less time.
So this is something I'm interested in looking into as well, because this is becoming a bit of a time sink for something that should be fairly straightforward. So I think I would propose that maybe the department and the commission reach out to NEPL.js, get some more information about their processes, and then look into ways that we can automate the commission and the department processes so that this is a lot more seamless and straightforward, because I think the registrations that are coming in now often are incorrect or have errors or information missing, and it does seem like a process that could be streamlined or automated in some type of way. So maybe we can work offline and also reach out to NEPL.js to get more information about their processes and how things work with them, and then we can come back to the group with the information that we find out and some proposals for making things a little better.
I would follow up. I can say with 100% certainty that we don't receive information about what systems are ultimately constructed and interconnected. We don't know that, so you'd have to get that from the utilities. I can say with about 65% certainty that you can run a search in UPUC and get an Excel spreadsheet that has every single net metering project that ever applied for a CPG, and one of the fields is were the recs retained by the CPG holder, or they transferred to the utility. So that data is available, I can say with some certainty.
Yeah, but if you don't know if it's been installed and the utilities don't track based on the CPG number, it's impossible to actually use that database effectively for some of these issues and track what really is going on. So maybe I'm just recommending that it could be helpful to have a checkbox on install yes or no at some point in that process, or there may be other automation ways. I appreciate you looking into that.
So would we ask the CPG holder to come back to the PUC with another filing requirement, say when it was interconnected?
Fine. I mean, if it literally is something like check a box, you know, we wouldn't have any problems with that.
That's a recommendation that BEPSA had made in the net metering rulemaking process, that there be a requirement for an as-built certification once the project was actually installed, and that would have kind of closed the reporting loop and also accounted for any potential changes in like system size that could happen that wouldn't have triggered the filing. So we would support that recommendation, that there be a affirmative filing from the customer or the developer or at the end of the project installation.
GMP would support that as well.
I would just say unless there's some sort of consequence, if that doesn't happen, the data quality is not going to be good.
Agreed.
Well, the credit, sure, but I mean, we as the utility would have to verify that they've gone in to do that, because our process is separate from PUC at that point, after they file the registration.
I mean, alternatively, given that the utilities are the ones who know when something interconnects them, you could go back and check box.
I would feel more confident in that data. I mean, we have processes that we do. It would be another step for us. It's not.
Okay, so the utilities would then submit something that's saying the project is connected. You all support that idea.
It's a question of who bears the burden, right? The
Right.
utility on behalf of all ratepayers, or the individual ratepayer who's potentially benefiting as a net metering customer. We'd prefer that come from the CPG holder. I think we could build a process to have an additional layer of reporting from the utilities. It's really a policy question.
Helpful, thank you. There is anything further on that topic? We'll move on to the next issue raised by the department. So the next topic was the format of the rule, and the department suggested that where possible, the rule reference any required forms as provided by the commission, and then maybe not include all of the particular details of what would need to be included on the form, so that forms could be updated as needed with new information. My question on that one would be, could the department go through the 8550 order and identify any sections specifically where you think maybe it's too prescriptive right now? That would be helpful. And then did others have comments or questions on this one?
Yeah, the department can do that.
Okay, great, thank you. The next topic was Tier 1, and the department voiced that it supported giving the utilities full discretion regarding their annual treatment of their REC inventory with respect to which RECs are used for compliance versus which are banked. Didn't see any objections to that in the other comments. Anyone have any other thoughts on that? The next topic gets into several issues related to Tier 3. And I think we already covered the first issue, which was the summary table to be used when the utilities are submitting their annual Tier 3 plans and reports. So the department will work with the utilities to come up with a proposed summary table as part of looking at the Excel spreadsheet. The next issue was the administrative cost issue. So the department had proposed a definition for administrative costs, as well as how administrative costs should be allocated. And I know that there were some concerns from several of the utilities about being overly prescriptive with the administrative cost issue. So what are folks' thoughts on the definition as well as the process for allocating the administrative costs for tier 3 projects? Barry?
Right. So our reason for including this is obviously administrative costs are real costs for the tier 3 program. And we just want to ensure that there's consistency amongst the DUs when they're reporting the administrative costs, that they're including the same things. So that it's a real cost that you can compare from one DU to the next. And that's really what we're trying to get at here. I mean, whether or not you're able to track them on a specific project basis would be great, but it's not necessarily something that we would need you to do. I mean, as we suggested here, that it could even be based upon a weighting on the megawatt hours, and that's how you could break it out overall. But really, we do think that it's important that we know what the administrative costs are for, if at all possible, for the individual programs or projects that you're doing. Maybe for the custom ones might be easier to track rather than the prescriptive pieces. But definitely for an overall, for the tier 3 piece, we really would like to see what those administrative costs are. And especially since they are real costs. And they do belong on the tier 3, so it should be reported.
So you're content with applying some methodology because we've got administrative costs that really come in like a pool of resources that work on a lot of different things and don't necessarily report time and every.
Yeah, as long as we can know what that methodology is, and as long as it's applied uniformly across the DUs, if possible or where possible, yeah, I think we'd be okay with that. But we really wouldn't like to get a handle on what these administrative costs are, and make sure that they're being reported consistently. As I say, consistency is really what we're looking for here, if at all, where possible.
I guess without knowing what everybody's methodology is, it's hard to. I mean, I'm not sure if you mean include that we're all including the same types of costs.
Yeah.
Depending on how you handle projects internally, how you break down those costs may be different among the different utilities.
I think in terms of like the large buckets, shall we say, as long as we're including the same large buckets, exactly how they're broken down might differ between the different accounting practices between the DUs, but at least if we're calling it the same thing and it's mostly the same thing, I think that's really what we'd be okay with that overall.
Do you have a list of elements in mind?
We have developed a list of, we went through a process similar to this with EVT through the administrative cost.
All the EEU.
All the EEU stuff. And we did develop a list of administrative and non-administrative costs. So I think that would at very least provide as a starting point for the discussion of what costs should be included and what shouldn't.
We can send that around, and we could add this with not trying to make the meeting that we're going to have last for ages. But we could possibly add this to the list as a discussion point as well. But I think it would be helpful for everyone to see what we figured out with the energy efficiency utilities, especially when that includes 2 utilities.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of our concerns is that we get too complicated and burdensome in terms of reporting. So we just don't want to go down that path, but if we can work through kind of some details of what you're looking for and try to keep it simple.
Yeah. We're not looking for being counting every hour spent on every project. That's not our intent. Like Barry said, we just want to agree on some kind of consistent way so we're somewhat comparing apples to apples.
So any other thoughts about the administrative cost issue, or shall we move on? The next topic was the approval of annual plans for tier 3 projects. The propose a process and schedule by which the plans would be deemed approved absent an investigation by the commission. I know several utilities voiced concerns with having an approval process. At least one or two seemed okay with a deemed approved process. And GMP also suggested mid-year check-ins with the department as an alternative to the approval process. So what are people thinking about that topic?
I guess I would just jump in again and say if there were an approval process with public comment opportunities, that might be a point for the non-electric people to, jump in and say, hey, we think we could be part of your program,
So the Tier 3 annual plans are filed now November 1st. And then there often is a workshop that the commission holds for asking questions about the plans. So I think there is some process there right now.
Right. I think we need to just get better involvement with that.
Others? I know folks have concerns about an approval process, but how are the utilities feeling about a deemed approved process in line with the schedule proposed by the department?
I think that, from our perspective, we want to be really careful. One of the, forget which one of the 8550 orders stated that there was no reason, that we were not going to have an approval process. So I guess we're not clear what's changed that would necessitate that. And so we just want to be really careful that we don't add process that's not going to really benefit or improve the program. Part of Tier 3 is to be innovative and nimble, and so there is some concern that having such a regimented process and under that process you could get to January 15th and suddenly open an investigation on a plan that you're supposed to be implementing on January 1. So it just seems like we could really be running into some problems if that type of a process continued. If you just had it deemed approved on January 15th and that was the end of it, I guess that we could work with that. But these plans are pretty nimble, and for good reason. I mean, you're constantly working on these projects and tweaking them and seeing what works and what doesn't, and then all of a sudden you'll have to switch midstream. I mean, I believe we had that with our 2017 plan, where we had anticipated, I think that heat pumps were going to really fill that program, and they didn't. Something unexpected came up, and so we probably, that's what we want to keep in mind here. So.
It's my understanding, based on the department's most recent comments, is they would be seeking not for the commission to say, we like your mix of resources, but rather the plan that you've submitted meets the requirements of Tier 3. And it attributes no judgment to what projects you've selected. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I don't think that, we don't see any change in the nimbleness. And right now, there's a requirement that if there's programs that are dropped that were included in the annual plan or added, there's already a requirement that there's a notification for that. And we wouldn't be asking for anything more. As we said, we're not looking at, we're gonna do 20 heat pumps. Oh, wait, no, we're not. We're gonna do 10. Oh, wait, no, we're gonna do 50. That is not the level we're looking for, and that's not what happens in the energy efficiency plan process either. There's always that nimbleness to change programs or offerings based on the needs and what you're seeing in the market. So we wouldn't see that changing. But to say, again, like what's changed, I think, as the department mentioned last time, we've definitely seen plans that don't address all the things that were meant to be addressed. And our hope is if you have an approval process, it's very well spelled out what that process is, when things happen, what happens if there is discrepancies or things that haven't been addressed, how that's handled. And we tried to map out a process that would be succinct and not add a lengthy additional process. We're happy to consider other dates, pushing it earlier if there's a concern about when the plan would have final approval. But it would certainly be the department's hope that we'd be working with the utilities beforehand to address any issues so that we would not get to that point where we would need to continue our process on after the December date. That's what we'd be striving for, but if we need to push back the schedule earlier to make sure that happens, we're certainly willing to do that.
Kelly, that's actually very helpful. I mean, I think we could sit down and go through that. I think one of the things that concerned us the most was not losing that ability to be nimble. So it might be helpful to understand exactly what's getting approved, if we could maybe specifically identify that.
Absolutely.
That might address some of our concerns. And then at the end, I'm not sure what the reason would be for an investigation, and maybe, you know what I mean, you're either going to get your savings or be told you can't have your savings at the end. So that investigation hanging over, I'm not sure what we'd be investigating. So it might be helpful to talk through that as well.
Sure.
The other concern that WEC has is we don't want to open up an administrative proceeding around approval, so that we have to come in for workshops and reviews. And I'm going to ask the question to the PUC, could you turn around approvals on a timely basis? So it's not like an IRP process that we file something, we ask for approval. It might be 6 months, it might be 2 months, it might be a year and a half. It's kind of this, I don't want to have public hearings. It's really want to be quick and nimble and make sure that we're not bogged down in administrative workload rather than delivering programs.
Well, we're already holding an annual workshop for Tier 3, so I think the department's proposal doesn't really introduce any change in that regard, other than giving some certainty. Hey, PUC, you need to schedule your workshop pretty early, which we're not always good about. To the extent that it is analogous to a tariff review process, we usually issue orders on tariff filings consistent with the 45-day statutory requirement. To the extent that we could come up with a template order if necessary, I think we could turn them around pretty quickly. But we're all usually pretty busy, you folks too, at the end of the year.
Right, but if this cascades into, we have to give notice in the local paper, we have to give certain, like a tariff, we have to give certain notices. For the IRP, we have to have a public hearing. So if this turns into that, if it cascades into several notice provisions, I'm still concerned about approval. This is this amorphous thing that it sounds easy, but I'm concerned about what it could cascade into.
Yeah, I guess we're building off the EEU process, so we don't have any of that kind of notification. So we are trying to stick to that same kind of process, which is pretty succinct, and it does not run on past January. I'm not sure if the PUC has answered whether you think that this deemed approval option would be possible. I'd love to hear that. I thought it might be, but.
I can't say. There have been various proposals over my career here for deeming things approved, and various makeups of the commission have had various levels of comfort with that. So I can't answer for this commission, but we'll certainly take that upstairs and ask them.
I have a question. I guess maybe it's more of like a legal or procedural question, but in the schedule it says, in the department's comments, it says if the department or the commission does not raise questions regarding whether an annual plan, then it goes into the process. But is it possible to actually limit, if it's a formal PUC approval process, the objection to the department and the commission, or does this open it up to any sort of public intervention if we have this process?
I think what we were trying to get at is that there would be comments in the last week of November, and that can include stakeholder comments. I think we were envisioning that the PUC could always say that other stakeholder comments deserve further investigation. We just didn't think that, you know, we didn't want to stop the process for any comment that could possibly come in. We thought that that could be really burdensome, and that, but there might be more weight given if the commission or the department had concerns given our role in the compliance of Tier 3 and, well, all of us. But
yeah, I mean, just my question gets to the concern that Patty raised about it kind of us being a spiraling process where now we're having hearings and we're not able to implement programs and things just get tied up in, you know, filing comments and all sorts of, you know, like a long drawn out process for an individual program.
that would certainly be good to hear feedback when the PUC and what, on all of that schedule proposal and whether that's really gonna work before we go forward with a decision on that. And that would be one of the items.
And just to add one kind of, to try to color the conversation, hitting the Tier 3 targets each year is hard, and it's getting harder. So, you know, delays in implementation or process involved in, you know, examining programs in the year where those credits are trying to be achieved becomes, you know, adds to that challenge.
Yeah, Reps and DED share the concerns that the other utilities have articulated. We're supportive of the department's proposal and in the interest of increasing transparency. To the extent that those dates are formalized, to the extent that we do have a date under which we know we can move forward with programs, we like the deemed approved approach where we can roll out our programs without having uncertainty, and I think what led us to support this proposal is it potentially gives us more certainty than we currently have right now. The PUC obviously could open an investigation on any of our Tier 3 plans at any point, and there's no timeline in the order or in statute, obviously. So to the extent that this increases certainty for all parties, we support the proposal. But if those dates were eliminated and it was left as an open-ended approval process, we would have serious concerns.
I'm just thinking it's almost like analogous to a net metering registration. 10 days it's deemed approved, but if somebody intervenes, it can go on and on and on. So I think even having a timeline is great, but when somebody intervenes, then suddenly it deviates from that timeline and it's basically out the window.
Should we move on to your topic, or any other thoughts on approval of annual plans? So I think that covered all of the department's topics. Looking at the utilities individual comments, the only thing that I had noted that wasn't, that we haven't already addressed, was that several of the utilities expressed that they would be agreeable to providing a load growth estimate as part of their Tier 3 process. Did any of the utilities want to speak to that topic in greater detail, or does the department want to respond?
Can you summarize the ask again on the load growth? How many years forward? Is it 1 year at a time? What's the forecast you'd be looking for? Just
Assume one-year plan.
Is it 1 year at
It's a
a time?
one-year plan, so I would assume, you know, you carry the forecast forward, but the impact from that year's plan is gonna be the same typically for several years forward. Those averages.
as long as it's not a 20-year load forecast. Just checking.
Mini IRP every year.
Exactly. Things.
I guess we would need a little more clarity on that, and I'm not sure if that came from the department's comments that were filed in the other docket. It's been a little bit hard to keep track of the comments, but I thought that the impetus behind that recommendation was so that the utilities could discuss how they were going to manage ongoing load from electrification. So I'd be curious whether it really was a 1 year look. We need a little more clarity on that versus a long-term forecast. Cumulative
We can go
demand
back and clarify.
impact.
Yeah.
As part of any, you know, additional activity related to load growth. I think we should address marginal emission rates. You know, Vermont is pretty unique as a state in terms of where you get your power from. It's very dependent upon where you are in the state. If you're in Burlington, you know, you're looking at hydropower from Quebec or, you know, other sources. But elsewhere, you may be pulling in power from the Iceland New England grid, and there's a lot of contentious issues being addressed now by ISO New England in terms of, especially during peak winter periods, such as what we're going to have soon this week. Where is that power coming from? So, and are we firing up coal and 6 oil-fired plants, you know, or is it, you know, during peak periods? Not to make life terribly complicated, but I think there needs to be some recognition of that issue. I know that's definitely another thorny topic, so I'll just stop there.
So is the proposal that would happen as part of the overall res, or is that unique to Tier 3 measures?
I don't know. I don't think I would venture to answer that. I think it's such a complex issue that you know, I don't think we could come up with with a complete answer. But I think there should at least be a qualitative recognition that intentionally adding electric load during peak winter periods does have ramifications on the grid, both in terms of the environmental attributes of incremental power generation at the margin, as well as the cost impact to all ratepayers, you know, for utilities that are purchasing power, you know, from the grid under ISO.
Does the tag measure characterization of those measures that would most likely be working during peak winter times take that into account? What is the system mix while those units would be in service?
Well, the tables that VEIC put together, if I remember right, they reflect just the average generation mix.
It just looks at an annual projection of how many additional kilowatt hours would be produced as a result of the measure, and it doesn't consider load profiles.
Tucker, Williams, VEC. Back to the load growth piece of the Tier 3 plan, load forecast. Are we talking about just the impact from the Tier 3 plan itself, or are we looking at a load forecast similar to what we would provide for the IRP, where we're looking at a base forecast typically provided by a third-party consultant that's driven by economic factors, in addition to forecasts on net metering installations and Tier 3 all layered on top of each other? Just wondering what's exactly, I didn't see the initial proposal, like this is first I've heard, so.
I think we need to go back and just try to map this out a little further. I would hate to speak out of turn. I mean, my first initial reaction is that it doesn't seem like it would make sense to have just impact of like Tier 3 measures as far as electrification and not at least mention that there's a counterbalance like through net metering. But I think the department just needs to think a little bit through this and try to put out some advisement of like what we would think and discuss it and see what the DUs think. But it seems like you wouldn't want to do it in isolation because of that. But. Another one for the list.
All right.
Here we go. We'll have an all-day meeting. It'll be fun.
All right.
Yeah.
So I had not noted any other unique comments in the utilities filings? Were there any other topics that I missed from the utilities? Not at this point, okay. So then the last set of comments were from the National Biodiesel Board. And I think we've covered at least one or two of them. Let me.
I think we covered most of them.
Have we
so,
covered most
yeah.
of them? Okay, but let's make sure. You did suggest that utilities use third parties to fulfill all or most of the tier 3 obligations.
Well, that's sort of a zinger to, it's a way of voicing frustration on the part of people in the energy industry, here in Vermont who are not part of the world of electricity. Okay, so the other states in New England, have basically programs where the electric utilities purchase, certificates, and there's all the activities behind those certificates are pre-qualified by the state PUCs, but they're implemented, generally managed by non-utility partners. So there's this arm's length attribute. Okay, in this case, well, Vermont is more of a homegrown state. Okay, and I'm from upstate New York, and I much prefer coming to meetings in Vermont than I do going to meetings in New York, where for every issue, for each person you have here in New York, you have at least 10 times as many people as well, especially people from New York City. Okay, so we can make anything more complicated and just difficult. Okay, so I think if we could break through the issue of the entirety of the program being electrification, I think a lot of this would go away, And so I think if we have more robust public engagement during the workshop, maybe make that a little bit earlier, so that, we don't slow down the folks here. I think that would help to resolve this. Now, and Matt and I've had discussions about the biodiesel folks here in Vermont really could and should talk with each of the obligated parties and say, hey, we're willing to give you enough activity to provide you with the megawatt hours that you need to fill the gap, okay, at a very economical price. Okay, I mean, it's Matt, I guess my feeling is there's almost the grounds here from making a uniform price, uniform program offer across the board. Okay, so.
You had one other comment that I just wanted to clarify. So you commented that the commission should oversee funding to ensure there is proper differentiation between the use of shareholder versus ratepayer funds for implementation of Tier 3.
Yeah.
Just clarify what you were getting at.
Yeah. There's a lot of subjectivity to the selection of measures, and there are concerns, legitimate concerns in the case of an investor-owned utility. Do you maybe do one type of activity versus another based on what is best for the ratepayer, or what is also then what is best for the the shareholder? And I know that you have still a special relationship here in terms of regulation of the utilities. Okay, I want to be respectful of that, but I think without going into the weeds too deeply on that, I think that while increased electric sales will help an electric utility in terms of, how would you say, spreading the fixed cost over a wider base of kilowatt hours of consumption. The impact on the energy charge, in other words, what we pay to ISO New England for power generation, or under that process, that those energy charges often just pass through. They're not really analyzed the way they should be. There are increased costs to everybody when we intentionally add load that shows up over severe peak conditions. This is a very complicated subject, but it's of growing importance. It's a very painful one. Also, as when you watch marginal pricing at ISO New England, I have ISO New England on my computer. Every day I watch the marginal pricing throughout the northeastern United States, and when you see prices going up well past $100 per megawatt hour due to heavy loads switching to oil for generation, or the price of natural gas, spot market natural gas going up. Okay, there's a lot more that we need to consider in terms of that, what is best for the ratepayer.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any reaction to the Mr. Albrecht's comments on shareholder versus ratepayer funds?
I do want to say something that in the context of getting away from the abstract and talking about what the Tier 3 projects actually achieve, they're making a tremendous difference in offsetting fossil fuels and improving efficiency for our customers. What we're seeing is satisfied customers. We're seeing fossil fuel reductions. Examples like diesel generators being decommissioned that consume 30 and 40,000 gallons of diesel fuel per year. Trying to make progress on getting gas-powered vehicles off the road and replaced with electric vehicles. A really difficult challenge for all of us. So, using the Tier 3 program to focus on achieving those goals seems to me to be really supportive of the intent of the energy plan and the res.
Mr. Smith, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just had a question on, you were making a point which I have some sympathy to, watching the interaction between electric demand, LMP prices, etc. My question was just, are you basically noting here today that that if that proper evaluation of programs that add electric load is something we need to watch, if you will, or is it your sense that presently the way GMP or other entities are evaluating the costs and benefits of these programs that we're blowing it or missing something big in that regard?
Yeah, I'd say across the Northeast United States, from New York through New England, that there's not enough attention paid to what is happening to the grid, okay, and what the wholesale price of power becomes as power becomes especially expensive under heavy load conditions, and then also the same attention to the environmental attributes of the grid. Okay, so as we increase electric load on the grids in New York and New England, which are heavily interconnected, by the way, as we increase loads, the environmental characteristics deteriorate rapidly. Okay. On the other hand, if through efficiency and the addition of renewable power, okay, as we add those types of activities and the strain on the grid drops off, okay, even if it's just a marginal, incremental relief to the grid, the environmental characteristics of the grid improve substantially, okay, and it really, the grid is it's almost like a pressure cooker, so to speak. okay? I'm just saying that we need to pay more attention to that. And I'm not saying that all electrification is bad, okay? I'm very much open, and, you know, my personal background is, it has been fuel neutral for decades, okay? Some of you know that I spent 30 years running the renewable heating and cooling program at NYSERDA, okay? So I'm, you know, my background is indeed very broad, so, sure.
To your point, I think that's important to consider and look at moving forward. I think this directly relates to the discussions we had a while back on whether or not to allow residential storage to be included for Tier 3 credit. I think the main argument here is primarily the same, looking at the different times on the grid. The fuel supply is more or less green. In that case, one of the major talking points was that the RES is specific to in-state fuel use, and if we're reducing, or if we're improving the greenness of the ISO New England grid, can we prove that carbon reduction is happening within state boundaries? So if we ruled one way in one case, I think we would want to at least be consistent across the board. Because battery usage, you know, storage can help that problem that you're talking about.
Yeah, or thermal storage as well.
Any kind of storage.
Hot water, chilled water, yeah, they're all valid, yeah.
And that would add more flexibility and more nimbleness to utilities and their overall strategy.
So can you clarify, are you making an argument for consistency with the statement that you just made? Or are you trying to say that the concerns about managing our energy supply and our Tier 3 plans should be only around reducing emissions in the state?
I think
I just wanna try to
consistently,
follow
yeah,
the point there.
not picking a side on either fence there. I just think that we need to keep in mind that we may have argued a certain way on the residential storage program, and we want to be consistent if we start bringing that piece of the analysis into how much each Tier 3 technology measure is worth for carbon credit.
Well, I think that's an important point, because if that's the case, then utilities should not be getting renewable energy credit for nuclear energy that is procured out of the state. So I appreciate the change in BEC's position with that statement.
Sorry, but we're not getting renewable energy credit for.
No, but I think you're seeking to reduce your compliance under the RES for Tier 3 because of your purchase of nuclear energy.
The difference was renewable versus non-fossil fuel.
Right, so it's, I think that the renewable energy standard, as its name, is about renewable, not non-fossil fuel. So if you're making a point that we need to be focusing on our emissions in the state, then, you know, I think that should also apply to how you're seeking compliance or waivers of compliance or reductions of compliance for the renewable energy standard in Vermont based on your out-of-state power purchases, which I understand that's another docket, but perhaps these are issues we also need to be looking at with the integrity of the RES as a whole.
I think the major difference there is the renewable energy credits that utilities are retired in Vermont. So I think that would be the big difference.
Yeah, and I'll just say that Tiers 1 and 2 directly relate to the renewability of our power portfolio, and Tier 3 specifically relates to fossil fuel reduction, was the argument that we were making in our filing.
Yeah, and that is supported in statute.
Yeah.
I would just throw out a pitch, again, for consistency, and I do think that Olivia is raising a really important issue around the nuclear, whether the nuclear portion of a portfolio can count towards the utilities' fossil-free credit, essentially. I think from BEPS's standpoint, again, we favor consistency and transparency, and I think that that was potentially an unfortunate process that was followed in that decision making. And again, I hope that we set up through the RES rule a framework where where all utilities are treated equal and there is transparency around decision making. And I don't know if the DPS is the steward of that. I don't know if that's something that is assigned to the TAG. I mean, I think that's another discussion potentially down the road in this proceeding, what responsibilities are assigned to the TAG. But again, the issue of nuclear, whether that's the right policy decision or not, again, I think that could have been a more transparent discussion, and again, one that applied to all utilities. In our view, if the department is aware of one utility using one methodology and another using another, that should potentially be brought to all utilities and be made public, rather than having a utility, have it be incumbent on one utility to file a revised filing and then the ultimate outcome being a PUC order. So again, just that I hope that the rulemaking process kind of clarifies some of that. And again, I'm not sure if that should be something that the TAG is responsible for or not, and that's something I think is worth exploring further. To what extent is the TAG a policy making forum? This came up when Matt was making his comments as well. Is that the forum? Is that the appropriate forum for partnerships and for involving technologies other than electrification, or potentially not? But is there a forum for those conversations to happen if the TAG is not the right place?
Yeah, and I mean, there's not a lot of public information around the TAG. There's no, when are they meeting? None of that is posted or available to the public for people to be participating in. So it should be, I think, a clearer process.
Well, I think the TAG has the TAG been dormant now for a couple of years with the
It's alive and well.
No, we typically start meeting over the summer and finished up in November this last year, I think. It's like a 5-month window where
Okay.
it's a monthly meeting.
All right.
Doug Smith, GMP, just to support something my colleague, Mr. Monder, said. In our view, on this point of if and how nuclear energy in a portfolio should count, I think the distinction that a couple of commenters made, in our view, is absolutely right. It's not being claimed as renewable, but in our view, the statute is clear that with respect to the essentially conversion calculation of BTUs for purpose of Tier 3 to convert transformation projects into Tier 3 credit, in our view, the statute is clear on that point. I'm making a distinction between some of the other topics we discussed today. There are much more, I think, there's a much more broad field as to how to interpret the guidance, in our view, that the RES statute gave. On this point, it looks much clearer cut to us. As the conversion fraction is about non-fossil fuel and what amounts constitute non-fossil fuel. So in our view, it hasn't warranted the same type of exploratory dialogue that some of these other topics seem to clearly warrant.
Well, and I think, frankly, that it's not for utilities to be deciding that. And we're very concerned about those orders. Unfortunately, we didn't know about it until after the fact and weren't alerted to it until another utility tried to seek compliance and calculations in that fashion. And this issue has not been discussed, and it certainly should be put on some type of agenda.
I definitely support clarification. I think part of the issue is this was our first compliance year, and so there were some things that fell into a gray area, and these are just some of the things that I think are the growing pains of getting started with a whole new program.
I think from GMP's perspective, we're not against clarification, but as far as a lack of clarity or a need for a clarifying dialogue, just to be clear, we're not seeing it. The legislature, in defining the conversion, BTUs for purposes of tier 3 could have defined it in terms of fraction of the power that's not renewable. They didn't. So just not objecting to have a further dialogue, but I don't think you've missed something up till now, in my view. I don't think you've been remiss.
For the department's part, we looked at the statute after when we got BEC's compliance filing, and we did see, notwithstanding that it's a renewable energy credit, that if you just look at the plain language of the statute, it does speak in terms of reducing fossil fuel emissions, and so that's why we took the position that we did. We were expecting more analysis in the order that eventually came out approving the plan. We thought that it was going to be more analysis or discussion regarding that point, so.
And VEPSA and BED don't take a position on the nuclear piece, but again, my point is for consistency, and that when that came to the department's attention, that utilities were handling their power supply portfolios differently, that there should have been communication around that, and there should have been some clarity around what utilities should be doing. It shouldn't be left to the individual utilities to interpret the statute. GMP has its interpretation. There should be more openness and clarity around treating utilities the same.
Just for my own understanding, so would that have looked like us, when BEC's motion came up, contacting the DUs individually and saying, this is what we are thinking of filing? Because I just don't know the process.
I think from my standpoint, it would have looked like when you got 2 compliance filings from 2 different utilities that were implementing a different methodology, flagging that as a potential issue.
Okay.
I mean, if
this issue was identified in the TAG meeting with all the DUs present.
Yeah, the DUs. Sorry.
A different issue, that's a different issue.
Yeah.
But that was identified and all DUs were present and we brought that to their attention. And the question is, how is that issue going to be handled in front of the PUC?
Right.
I think to Lisa's point, this is a feature of, a characteristic of a program that's being developed and we're figuring it out. And one thing that I think we learned was that within the TAG process, it might be helpful to work through how each utility is actually calculating things and what models it's using and that kind of stuff, so that we can compare notes as we're kind of going into a year, and I think that would be a helpful exercise.
I'm not directly involved in the TAG process, but I guess it was my understanding that all the utilities were participating, and that, if there was an issue that came up like this that someone thought was more of a policy decision that shouldn't be decided in TAG, that would be raised. But I'm happy to do what you're saying, is like, if we can define more like what are appropriate things for TAG to discuss and decide, and what's more appropriate to be decided in another avenue, I think that would be great clarity to have. And again, maybe this is a particular example, an instance of a learning lesson of like, maybe that wasn't, I'm not saying it was or not, but maybe that wasn't the right place to have the discussion and a decision made. And we'll, happy to learn from that and do it differently next time.
So agreed that it's a learning opportunity and not looking to assign fault. It's really more about, I think it was raised at the TAG that GMP is using this methodology. That was a piece of information that the other utilities received. But I think the next step would have been, what is the TAG's position on this? What is the department's position on this? And bringing that before the regulators. Mm-hmm. Right? The utilities are meeting a regulatory requirement, and the parameters of that are a little bit fuzzy. And I'm not VEPSA and BED are not comfortable with that fuzziness.
Sure. So this was also, it was a little bit of a timing issue. So we filed our compliance reports in March, and then the department made a recommendation in June, and this issue surfaced in August, which was when it was the end of August, and then we went ahead and refiled after some discussions with the department. So again, I think it's just a fact, GMP had certain assumptions and didn't think to raise the question. We had certain assumptions and didn't think to raise the question. And I think it's just a matter of the messiness of the first compliance year in this case. But it'd be great if we could all have the same understanding moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the importance of transparency in the process, particularly moving ahead.
Thank you. Do you have any other issues or questions?
No.
I guess, can
Sure.
I'm a daily watcher of ISO New England, the grid, okay, and they have a great website, okay, called ISO New England Express. And right here, I know you can't see it, but this sort of circular pie chart here shows the current energy mix, okay, for generation in New England, okay. And I guess my question, we'd like to take a stab at identifying what fuel is providing the marginal power currently, today, this week, in New England.
Pretty sure everybody in this room can answer that question, because we all have that same website up.
Yeah. So it's black, yeah, appropriately so, cold, okay, so that's, you know, I mean, that's why, you know, I don't want to belabor this, you know, worse than I have already, but, you know, I think when we talk about electricity use, it's the environmental characteristics of electricity are so sensitively dependent upon the time of day, okay, what the load is, what the weather is, okay. A good part of the time is very good, okay, but when you start purposely adding electric load under, you know, cold weather conditions, then the scale tips in the other direction, okay, and so, I guess the final thing is the Europeans have figured this out to a significant extent, to the point that in a number of countries they try to incentivize using heat pumps during mild to moderate weather, and then let the you know, fuel back up the load. So, and it should not be fossil fuel as your backup; it should be renewable fuel as your backup.
May I ask a quick question, whether the PUC takes an official position on whether it's tier 3 with a number or tier 3 with a Roman numeral?
I've been writing it with a Roman numeral.
Yeah, that's what the order says.
Yeah.
Can we have a subcommittee to change the name?
Let's do add that to the workshop, Kelly.
The order
uses tier 3.
I don't think there is an official position.
Springer.
Okay.
We will make sure that that is.
It would alleviate some internal discussion.
I think I was planning to use Roman numerals.
You know, you have one supporter here.
All right.
I've personally been trying to move away from
You know our pain.
We can bring this to the commission.
The order says Roman numerals, but I've seen it both ways.
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah, we'll get back to it on that.
Great.
All right, so if there aren't any other substantive issues to discuss, I was thinking we could talk a little bit about schedule moving forward and what next steps should be. So I know that there are quite a few items that the group is going to discuss separately from this meeting. Is there a timeline that you're envisioning for that meeting and when you would be capable of filing something in writing with the commission?
I mean, given the set of players that are involved in this, I would think it would take a few weeks even to find a date, a few weeks out to find a date that would work for all the organizations. So, is there a way we could do that first? And
Yeah, could we maybe set a date 2 weeks after a meeting or 2 or 3 weeks after a meeting that we would schedule and call you guys with that information?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it will need to also take multiple meetings. It
Right.
could. There's a lot on the list as of now.
There is, and I'm wondering if we can move forward with the two processes simultaneously. So the group working on the issues, the thornier issues that have been identified, the more complicated things, but then maybe also still moving forward with trying to get some type of draft rule language out to everyone by April 1st. So I'm currently working on a framework based on the 8550 order, including the things that folks seem agreeable to and are straightforward changes, And so I think my goal would be, to issue something like that before April, or by April 1st. And that, but to know that that's a starting point for discussion and would not necessarily address all of the various more substantive issues that the group would still be discussing. So there might be some placeholder language, or just have the language from the 8550 order, and we would know, like maybe even with a comment bubble, the group is working on making changes to this section. Just because I feel like having language in a document like that to work from can really help to further discussions and drill down into the very specific things that we need to work on. So I think that'll be my plan, the April 1st deadline to get things out to you all in a real draft, and then probably asking for some written comments on that draft, or well, trying to think what, maybe a workshop immediately after the draft came out or something like that. I guess some of it will be dependent on where you all are in the process regarding the other issues and when you think you might be able to file something. So maybe the thing to do would be to not set any formal dates today for next steps, but to know that you're going to take actions to meet and that I'm going to work on getting a draft rule out.
Or maybe we could file a comment in, say, 3 weeks' time with the non-discussion issues, like, for example, the parts of the 8550 order that are too prescriptive, those kind of things. And that include the date that we had coordinated to have a meeting and what we would think based on that date would be for the next discussion. Does that sound good, Kelly?
Sure.
Yeah, so anything that can be easily followed up from this meeting in the form of a written comment, or if there are things that people just want to follow up on that maybe they didn't bring to the group today. I think written comments and a date for your meeting. Do you have your calendar up?
So that would be the 19th, would be 3 weeks from today. Yeah,
That's fine with me. Does that date work for other people to? Kelly?
I would find it helpful to know, like, I'm not quite clear when you're going through the previous order to determine what you are going to put in the rulemaking. Are you trying to have that be duplicative and all-inclusive, or are there priority items? Like, I'm not sure, should we be trying to categorize every single thing we think that was in the previous order should be in the rulemaking? I'm just not clear exactly like what you're seeing as a process, if you really want just everything included in rulemaking, or are there particular things that you think lends itself more to being in the rulemaking?
I'm not sure. I'm totally following the question.
Are you trying to have a rulemaking that encompasses all the stuff that was decided in the previous orders, or are you letting those orders lie and you're only including in the rulemaking things that maybe need to be changed or clarified?
I mean, I can't speak entirely to that. The commission's going to have to weigh in on all the substance that ultimately ends up in the rule. We're directed to do rulemaking, and to the extent that rule is all encompassing, I think it's preferred to put, we don't want to have to be looking back at 3 different orders plus a rule. So I think hopefully the rule would be as all encompassing as possible.
Yeah, my understanding was that part of this impetus is that the order, if a lot of the stuff rests in the order, it might no longer be consistent with the recent amendments to the Administrative Procedures Act. Is that part of what's going on here, needing to move some of this stuff into a rule?
I mean, there's a statutory requirement that we start formal rulemaking for the Renewable Energy Standard by July 1st, 2019. So that is what we are doing.
Right. I guess I just also thought that part of pulling all of whatever needs to be kept from the 8550 orders into a rule was because of the the amendments, and I think it was Act 156 in the last legislative session, but that's not, it's just.
No, the
solely
impetus
based
is
on-
the statutory requirement that we do this as a rule.
So could I just be clear, on what Allison said? What are you looking for by the 19th? Is that a letter from the DPS only?
So I think one would be a comment letter from the department, establishing a date by which you all are going to have another meeting, as well as responding to anything that the department can respond to that was raised today that doesn't need to be discussed by the broader group. And then that would also be the date by which the participants in this proceeding could file any, follow-up written comments, clarifications. If something came up today and you wanted to address it in a written comment, those comments would be due by February 19th.
Okay.
Just the more straightforward stuff, and maybe also identifying what we're working through.
Yeah, I was just trying to clarify whether it was just the department filing something on the 19th, or if you were looking for comments from
I mean, certainly if folks don't think that they need to file follow-up things, there's no need to file, but if there was something that you wanted to make another point about or address that didn't get addressed today, so we want to see.
Thank you.
Yep. Do you think there's anything else to cover with schedules right now? All right, well, any final issues before we adjourn for today? All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yep, see where
Bill, sorry, I do need to imply that we don't agree. We should let you know if we see issues like that. Yeah, but that was the first thing I told you. We agree with you 100% that we should have discrepancies between the views and how we work this stuff.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a sense to make your best deal with the department and let it fly.
Yeah, not at all. That's not how
Like, to have two competing methodologies implemented and, not precisely.
Yeah, and we don't feel like it's our place to make that decisive rule.
No,
We feel like it's
clearly.
PUC.
Yeah, but take a position, which you did, you supported JMG's method. I guess it's really been very on the electric mower request from TJ. Have you been able to? That's another one where it feels like
Yeah.
JMG's doing it, BED's doing it, but just giving the department a heads up where you want to do it. And there's been like radio silence. They emailed several times on electric mowers.
I can honestly, I haven't seen it. I'll have a look and see what it is. Was Keith copied in on that?
You were on the first one.
I am gonna just kind of to the broader point of who's doing what and response. We actually just recently, I'm gonna send an email out to all of you because this recently kind of divided the work into all because it's really too much. These are only technical guys in Bird, as you know. And so we're splitting like the utilities, and I'll put it in the email. So there'll be a third person, and then I'm gonna ask that I get CC'd on everything too, just so we can make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks. We don't want that. But there's only, you understand the resource limitations, but we don't want unresponsiveness. And I think it's just been not quite clear, you know, so we just try to figure it out.
TJ and I share here. It's a common share. In terms of closing the loop on that. Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Thursday, and I know
together.
Thanks. So happy, one of us would
DEC's not here today, just random.
Bill actually just went. Oh, we did, okay, so we're happy to, let us know when,
Okay, so just shoot you an email.
yeah, okay, that'd be great. Happy to do that. You're welcome.
How are you doing?
Yes. Yeah, let me know, and kudos for you for helping your town, 'cause that's.
It's like the first meeting happened and I wanted to, nails into my eyeballs. It was like, people were very kind of dated notions of what's going on in the energy sector and strong unions, not really grounded in reality, and I have to
Takes a whole different flavor with the local level.
it makes me really feel for the regional planning commissions that are helping their towns. They're just like, okay, well maybe do like a 101